Hello, and a warm welcome to today's webinar, Inclusive Green Economies, No Just Transition Without Gender Equality. I'm Ryan Maya, the Green Finance Platform's Community Engagement Consultant at the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, or GGKP as it is better known, and I would like to thank you for being here with us today. Before we get started, I would like to take a brief moment to introduce GGKP, a global network of experts and organizations dedicated to providing the business, policy, and finance communities with knowledge, guidance, data, and tools to transition to an inclusive green economy. If you aren't already familiar, I encourage you to visit one of our 3 knowledge platforms, the Green Policy Platform, the Green Finance Platform, and the Green Industry Platform. I am also excited to draw your attention to the GGKP Green Forum. The Green Forum is an online community space for sharing and discussing insights on a range of themes and issues related to a green economic transformation. The Green Forum hosts an ongoing discussion on gender, so please sign up and join the conversation at thegreenforum.org. And if you're keen for more GGKP on gender, we invite you to register for our March 15th webinar, Gender Responsive Sustainable Finance Towards Inclusive Market Economies, organized by the Green Finance Platform. The second webinar in the Aligning Finance Policy series, this event will focus on gender-responsive financial products and metrics that can unlock pools of capital for women-led businesses and business that positively impacts women. Register now at ggkp.org/grf. Looking forward, today's webinar will facilitate knowledge sharing, networking, and action in the lead up to the 66th Commission on the Status of Women, which, as many of you may know, is taking place from March 14th to 25th. Of course, gender equality is an absolute necessity for thriving, inclusive green economies. As highlighted in the recent IPCC report, gender-responsive policy at the global and local levels will be key to our climate-resilient future. Today, we will explore systemic barriers to women's full and equal participation in inclusive green economies. We'll learn from success stories, and we'll identify opportunities at the intersection of gender equality and the just transition. This webinar is the 5th and final session of a 5-part GGKP webinar series held under the IIED project, Green Economy Transformation, in cooperation with the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, PAGE, Synergies Between Low Emission Pathways and the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the GET project. The GET project is funded by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection, BMUV, implemented by the German Development Agency, known as GIZ, in collaboration with the United Nations Environmental Program, and is active in 6 countries: Argentina, Costa Rica, Indonesia, Peru, Uruguay, and South Africa. The GET project's goal is to strengthen institutional capacity to implement SDGs and NDCs using green economy approaches. GGKP has been a key partner in facilitating exchange of experiences, expertise, and good practice for a green economic transformation under the project. The 4 previous GGKP webinars organized under the GET project have spotlighted advisory services that are available free of charge to policymakers, policy advisors, and supporting institutes to support the transition to an inclusive green economy, including for green energy transformation, climate change mitigation, and implementation of NDCs, presented internationally agreed methodologies to measuring fossil fuel subsidies in the context of the SDGs, explored how green bonds are being assessed and utilized to finance sustainable infrastructure projects and address poverty, economic growth, and other SDGs at the local and national levels, discuss the impacts of green transitions on jobs, including how governments can support workers during a green transition, and key social protections as job profiles change or shift to new green sectors. While the GET project will terminate in the first half of 2022, its work on green economy transformation will continue through a follow-up project focusing more strongly on various dimensions of inclusiveness: skills, training, and access to jobs, distribution of wealth, and protection and participation of the most vulnerable, as well as the broad-scale decarbonization of our economies. In light of the strengthened focus on inclusion, the project team is thrilled that the GGKP has launched the Gender Expert Group, which will feature here today alongside a fantastic set of speakers who work on gender and inclusion in environmental policy. GGKP remains a key partner for BMUV as well as for the new GET project and looks forward to continued collaboration. Finally, some housekeeping. Please do submit questions and comments throughout the discussion, as it's a fantastic opportunity to engage directly with the panel. After the webinar, we would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete our short survey. Your feedback really is very important in helping us shape future webinars. And please note that a full recording of the webinar will be available on our website at ggkp.org/gender-equal-transitions shortly after the broadcast. You can also stay in the loop about future GGKP and Green Finance Platform webinars by signing up for our newsletter at ggkp.org/subscribe. And with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event. Dr. Amis is the co-founder and executive director at the African Center for Green Economy, a leading nonprofit think tank based in South Africa. The center's mission is to champion an inclusive and just transition in Africa by undertaking research and providing thought leadership. Dr. Amis has more than 15 years experience in the green economy sector in Africa and globally as a researcher and thought leader and advisor on a range of issues, including climate finance, low carbon development, inclusive business models, water stewardship, and so forth. Between 2016 to 2017, Dr. Amis was an adjunct professor at the Graduate School of Business, University of Cape Town, and currently serves as an external examiner for the MBA program at the Saïd's Business School, University of Oxford. Dr. Amis holds an MSc and PhD in conservation biology from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Dr. Amis, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I'm delighted, very honored to be your host this day. Ryan has already said the importance of gender equality can never be overemphasized. Without gender, we can truly never be able to achieve the just transition that we require. In the areas that we work in across East and Southern Africa, we're seeing that very clearly around the important role that women play in building resilience at the household level, at the level where vulnerability and the face of climate change is most apparent. So without equality, we will never be able to achieve a just transition. So I'm very delighted to have this major task of holding this conversation in the presence of well-decorated speakers and experts on this issue of gender equality. It's really a pleasure. I welcome all of you, and I know that's going to be really interactive and very engaging discussions. Without much ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speakers before we go on to introduce our panelists. Today, we are honored to have Mr. Simon Anderson, who is going to deliver the keynote address together with Susannah Fisher. Simon is Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development and co-chair of the GGKP Expert Group on Gender. He's a seasoned researcher and has served as a climate change research manager for UK's Department for International Development. And Ms. Susannah Fisher is a researcher working on the politics and governance of climate change. Susannah is currently a lecturer at University College London and a policy fellow at SOAS University of London. She was previously head of research at Europe's Climate Innovation Agency and a senior researcher at IIED. Over to you, Simon, to deliver your keynote address.
Thank you, Mal. And although I can't see everybody, it is nice to be here with you. I can see currently we have 79 participants. So with this keynote, what Susannah and I would like to do is to in a sense, contextualize the discussions that are going to happen subsequently by the panel. And we want to do this by looking at gender equality outcomes. What is it that we want to see at the intersection of green growth and just transitions, and importantly, in developing countries, at the intersection of those changes in sectors with the informal sector? Next one, please. Next slide. So being researchers, we set a hypothesis. When we see a statement like no just transition without gender equality, what do? Well, we set a hypothesis, and our hypothesis for the work that Susannah and I are conducting at the moment is that a shared understanding of gender equality outcomes in developing economies in just transitions increases the potential for more ambitious collective action. We want to move the dial. We want to move towards more transformative gender equality outcomes as a result of just transition processes. Next slide, please. Let's put some context on that. We know that just transition managed to pull itself up by its bootstrings and get into the Paris rulebook at COP26 in Glasgow, just down the street from me here in Edinburgh. And that was a big thing. However, we know that in developed countries, many governments still need to engage in dialogue, meaningful dialogue on socio-economic policies for climate action. But we can also see that there are tripartite structures and sector-wide bargaining that is now starting to become effective. We can see this in Scotland with the climate assemblies, the involvement of the unions and the involvement of the private sector, and we can see similar happening elsewhere. But the fact is that just transitions are still on the drawing board, so it's a good time to introduce the importance of gender equality. In developing countries, we see a more constrained context. Hydrocarbon-dependent developing countries face political tragedy of the horizon, as Mark Carney has put it. The flexibility and the space to look further than the political cycles, to look to the long-term changes that just transitions should mean, there is less opportunities to do that at this point, particularly where there's a lack of fiscal space for progressive policy making. Increasing debt, falling revenues, the economic impacts of the pandemic are all squeezing the space for progressive policy making on just transitions. And we know also that climate vulnerable developing countries are facing increased costs of debt precisely because of the climate risk that they are assessed as facing. So these things are conspiring against more progressive just transition policies. Next slide, please. So what are we looking for? And Susannah will go into more detail on these areas in the second half of this presentation. We're looking for things that happen at these three intersections, the intersections of gender equality, informality, green growth, and just transitions. Between gender equality and informality, particularly in developing countries, we can see outcomes already starting to appear in terms of regulation and formalization, and what happens then to employment opportunities, particularly for women. And we have seen in places like Tanzania and elsewhere that formalization of land tenure has actually led to elite capture by men. In terms of the intersection between informality and green growth and just transitions, we've seen, or we're beginning to see, that scaling up of green entrepreneurialism can actually exclude the informal sector and perhaps reduce benefits to women. And it is well known that there are high costs of technology, and these are operating as barriers, perhaps barriers important to the people in the informal sectors to join just transitions. And finally, between gender equality and just transitions, at that intersection, we can see the importance of women's contribution to defining the purpose and design of green growth and just transitions. We need to see that happening. Also, we need to see the demands of feminists and ecofeminists and others around the centering of care. How will that, at the transition of gender equality and just transition, enter into the picture, become part of the political program? So those are the types of things that we're looking at. But Susannah will now tell us in more detail how we're beginning to think about those things and develop a framework for assessing them. Susannah, please.
Thanks, Simon. So next slide, please, Jessica. So I think if we go back to how Simon started this intervention, our real interest is how can we raise the ambition of gender equality work around just transition. And Simon's talked a little bit about the practicalities of those three areas and how one way to do that is to think about what outcomes look like and what we're really aiming for in terms of a gender equality in a just transition. Now, another lens we've taken to open up those conversations is drawing on lots of really exciting work by Cohen and Duncanson and other academics and scholars who are thinking about, what about if we take a feminist theoretical lens to this? What different areas does it open up and how does it deepen what we can analyze as outcomes within the just transition? And what we've noticed through starting to pull apart these strands, drawing on this work, both in the academic sphere, but also very much in the policy and practice sphere, where, for example, the feminist Green New Deal has gained traction in countries such as the UK, is how this can open up the lens of analysis. So if we start very quite more traditional approach from drawing on feminist economics, we'll start really focusing on women within kind of traditional inverted commas green or brown sectors that are part of the transition and their role in getting a green decent job. But if we open up the lens, we start to look more at how are they affected by the life cycle of investments? What is the implications for relationships of solidarity, of the ideas of climate colonialism? What does it mean for defining the purpose of a green economy and the relationship between nature and society? So this theoretical lens allows us to look in a broader sense of what outcomes might be. Next slide, please. And what we then went on to do in the work, and it's still very much work in progress, so we're really excited to get some feedback from you all today, is that how when we start to look at these ideas in practice, we see a lot of fragmented work in different areas, drawing on green growth and gender, green growth and informality, but as Simon said, quite limited at the three intersection there of green growth, informality and gender. And also, whilst we're still in the process of mapping, we see that largely these interventions and practice is tending to cluster more at the gender sensitive, gender responsive end of the spectrum, and more at that first end of starting to look at a more kind of feminist economics perspective, starting with green jobs, and yet to kind of open out to those broader questions. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do through taking that theoretical lens and then looking again through research and practice was to try to understand what the gaps are in understanding outcomes around gender, informality and green growth within a just transition, and to see how, if we synthesize these very diverse perspectives, how it might open up new areas, in some ways ideas not yet done or projects not yet traveled, what new lenses it might provide us to think about how we can raise ambition around gender equality and look for more transformative outcomes, and what are the spaces of policy, practice and politics that we can open up through these new lenses to really find a new way and a more transformative way to secure gender equality within these processes. Thanks. And so the last slide, Jessica, is just to say thank you very much for your time today, and also to say that this is work in progress for us. So if you've heard this and you're thinking that you've got a great example or you've seen other things that you'd like us to consider, then please do get in contact with both of us below, and we'd love to consider projects and programs that you may be working on as part of this work. Over to you, Mao, I think. Thanks.
We're not hearing you just now, Mao.
Can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yes.
No, just say thank you so much to Simon and Susannah for framing, the challenge around gender equality and what are the opportunities that exist in trying to mainstream gender as we think about, a just transition. And if I may just highlight one example that we're seeing in the work that we're doing on the ground, particularly the linkage between informality and green growth, which you've outlined in that framework. We're seeing that when enterprises are just still at a very early stage, the informal way, there's very strong participation of women, the ones who are actually undertaking some of these innovations. But as enterprises get formalized and try to raise capital, for example, all of a sudden, female ownership automatically drops off. And the challenge is, how do you sustain, for example, this ownership issue of women and their more inclusive participation in how enterprises move through the innovation cycle, from just being an idea to being able to raise capital and so on. And for me, I think that it's really important that we think about these issues now before countries adopt, green growth policies and so on. That becomes the kind of a new economy that we all rely on. So thank you so much. I don't want to talk the stage. I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists who have got way more experience on these issues than myself. I'm really looking forward to that session. So first on our lineup is Ms. Lorena Aguilar, who is former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in Costa Rica. In 2006, she was a champion of Earth Laureate of Women's Environment and Development Organization, pioneer in the creation of international gender networks as a network of women ministers and leaders of environment and global gender and climate alliance. She's a board member of Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture and Natural Resources Management and Momentum for Change under the United Nations Climate Change Convention. And she's a global senior gender advisor and global director of the governance and rights program of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. That she served that role until 2018. So welcome, Lorena. It's a pleasure to have you.
Morning, Mao.
On this one. Thank you. Our second speaker is my country-mate from South Africa, Betty Mkatshwa. It would be useful to tell us where you're dialing in from. I'm based in Cape Town. Betty is a senior analyst at the South African Competition Commission and competition lawyer at Gilbert plus Tobin. She's also a co-author of a research project selected for OECD's 2021 Gender Inclusive Competition Policy, which explores the role of competition policy in creating a gender inclusive economy. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you, Mao.
Our third panelist is Cecilia Ugaz Estrada, who is Director of Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women Office at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and a special advisor to UNIDO's Office of the Managing Director, Director of Corporate Management and Operations. And finally, we have Dimitra. Xynou, I'm so sorry for murdering your name. You correct me. She's a policy analyst at OECD's Environment Directorate, focusing on gender environment nexus, mainstreaming gender equality and women's empowerment in environmental policies. Prior to joining the OECD, Dimitra held senior advisory positions in the Greek public administration and has worked as a policy advisor in the European Parliament and in the private sector. So ladies, welcome to this very important session. It's a pleasure to have you all around. So to just kickstart, I would like to invite Lorena to make her opening remarks around why is gender equality essential for a thriving and inclusive green economy.
Thank you very much, Mao. I think I would like to start by adding that, as my previous colleague presented, it's not about only inclusive green economies. They have to be equitable and they have to be just. We women are 3.65 billion solutions, and no one in his right mind will leave aside this power when it comes to this green transition that the world needs to go through. And we have said it repeatedly. I have worked in the environmental sector for more than 3 decades, that gender equality is a precondition to sustainable development. And what is a historical moment, Mao, is the last report from IPCC, and I say historical document because it's the first time that an IPCC report brings gender at the forefront in the way. Before, you had a couple of mentions here and there in some of the reports. And as Ryan pointed out, this last IPCC report talks about how an inclusive governance that prioritizes equity and justice, especially in adaptation planning and implementation, leads to more effective and sustainable adaptation outcomes. So I think that with that, Mao, I can leave the floor to my other colleagues.
All right, over to you, Betty. What's your take, and why do you think it's very important for gender inclusion? What are you finding from the work that you're doing?
Thanks, Mao, and thanks for the introduction. So I've done quite a bit of work in the competition law space, and the OECD project that you had mentioned was a paper that was exploring how competition law can be used to create gender equality, and that work stems from the South African experience in terms of competition law, but also in terms of broad economic policies. Where South Africa's, history in terms of racial inequality was very central to, the country making sure that it, develops policies that are inclusive, policies that bring in, individuals who were previously excluded by the system. So the work that I've then sort of done in terms of gender is really taking learnings from the competition law space and expanding them into the gender space. And obviously, as my other colleague has mentioned, we can't create an economy or even have policies that do not include half of the population in the world. If you look at competition law, for example, if markets do not include women and do not enable women to participate in the economy in all the various roles that they play, not only just as consumers or as just employees, but also as innovators, as business owners. If we do not accommodate women in all of those roles, then we're really selling ourselves short. So the work that I've done is really reflecting on the inclusion of women in creating, more inclusive economies, because without women, there really can't be an inclusive economic growth, and there can't even be, the most effective form of economic growth. So that would be sort of my remarks. So I apologize if you will be hearing a lot of competition law from my side, but I will definitely explain some of the concepts that I will be using and relying on to sort of shed light on how we can develop policies that are more inclusive, just using competition law as an example. Thank you.
Thanks, Betty. I would like to bring in Cecilia here. Cecilia, the role that UNIDO plays in industrialization is extremely important. And one of the things Simon pointed out in that framework, that is always that challenge of moving from informality to the green growth framework. How important is equality in the kind of work that you're doing in promoting industrialization?
Thank you, Mao, and it's also again a pleasure to be here and with this distinguished panel, and in particular with the audience that I see is increasing in numbers at the moment. So yeah, let me just be maybe making this kind of distinction, if you want, that of course gender equality is a good in itself. It's intrinsically valuable. So we are talking here about justice, justice and human rights, but it also has some kind of instrumental value, if you want. And actually, at UNIDO, we realized that women are the largest untapped source of talent that industry has at the moment in order to be able to start this transition towards a more justice and a sustainable future. So I think, for instance, if I can just take one example, I think increasingly we realize and established in good journals, reputable journals, as a good practice to have more diverse teams. It's as simple as that. Involving the voice of women, having women as part of active participants in decision making makes a big difference in terms of the way we conduct business, in the way we sort of trace our path towards sustainable industry. In terms of diversity, these teams that are actually more diverse are usually more efficient, are more profitable, are more prone to innovation. So there are lots of things that can also be attributable to the presence of women when we talk about sustainable industrialization. The other thing that I think is also interesting to notice is that there is some kind of research recently published that also mentions, for instance, that gender diversity in boards, in company boards, already reduced significantly the amount of energy consumption, the greenhouse gas emissions, and also water consumption. So actually, at the end of the day, having women also as part of the decision making, in companies, can also be very, very good for the environment. So I leave it there now.
Thanks, Cecilia. I think you emphasized it quite well. And moving to you, Dimitra, you're a policy analyst at OECD. What are the kind of trends you're seeing in terms of gender equality, and why do you think gender equality is important? And what are some of the barriers that are preventing women from effective full participation in the economy?
Well, Mao, at the OECD, we released a report in 2021 on the gender environment nexus. And we actually did try to see the two principles and the two goals, achieving gender equality and achieving environmental sustainability. And our research shows that they are both goals that are mutually reinforcing. We have, on the one hand, the differentiated effects of environmental impact on men and women, something that actually not everyone realizes or understands. Biodiversity loss, climate change, they have a different effect on men and women, depending on where they are, of course, and other factors, income, geography, etc. There's then what Cecilia also mentioned about women's preferences, behaviors, and we see a positive potential of including more women in the green transition, both as decision makers and also as economic agents. As Cecilia also referred to, empirical evidence and studies show that women have a more sustainable behavior, both at the household level, when we're talking about energy consumption, mobility patterns, but also at the business level and at the decision-making level. So these are the things that led us to look more closely at the gender environment nexus. Of course, when we're looking at the interlinkages, we're coming back to what others have also mentioned before, limited access to land and natural commons, barriers that we're still facing, women are still facing at work, access to finance, compounded with, of course, skill gaps and lack of information, and also on top of that, the disproportionate share of unpaid work that women usually have to suffer. So these are things that we also need to look into more carefully before going further into the environment thing. And one last point, what we also looked at, and that's more of the OECD perspective, let's say. At the OECD, we have a green recovery database. We cover all the green recovery measures that have been adopted by countries, OECD members mainly, during the COVID crisis. When examining these from a gender relevant and gender sensitive lens, we found out that only 2.5% of the measures actually did have a gender sensitive perspective, which means that there is still a long way to go until we actually integrate gender considerations into environmental policies, and of course, vice versa. Thank you, Mao.
Thank you, Dimitra. Simon, I know you've made your remarks in the initial keynote address. Is there any burning issue that you would like to, to articulate in reaction to the feedback that has just been put by the panel?
Yes, thank you. And I would also like to draw our attention to a comment in the chat from Laurie Krieger, where the importance of intersectionality is being emphasized. Of course, we recognize that intersectionality implies that not all women are the same. So when we're talking about gender equality, we're talking about intersectionality. One of the reasons why I feel confident to be able to say that is because the feminist paradigms that we're looking at through the research that we're doing brings that to the fore. It also means that through those paradigms, we're able to widen the lens in terms of this protection of the commons that so many women are involved with. And it also brings our attention to this important issue of raising the ambition. If we do believe, as I think we all do, that gender equality is a public good in itself, then that ambition needs to take us not only in that direction, but to that goal. If we look at progress against SDG 5, we can see that we're already faltering. The pandemic hasn't helped, the financial crisis didn't help either, but we also need to be considering how just transitions are vehicles for achieving the sustainable development goals around gender equality that we agreed upon all those years back. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. I think we all agree that gender equality is extremely important. But what are the barriers? What are the systemic challenges that are actually preventing women from participating, in an inclusive green economy? And how can we enable women's full and equal participation? Lorena?
Thank you, Mao. We have been working on identifying what we call the structural knots of inequality. And we have identified 6 structural knots of inequality. One are socioeconomic inequalities, persistence of poverty. The second one is inequitable control of and access to natural resources, lack of limited access to services and goods. The fourth is discriminatory and violent cultural patterns. Fifth, concentration of power in public domains. And one that usually the environmental sector doesn't take into account is the unfair social organization of care. These are the 6 structural knots of inequality. So when we talk about having initiatives that are gender responsive or gender transformative, we need to address these structural knots. So if the actions that we are taking into account to have a most just, fair, and equitable green transition doesn't have an impact on these structural knots of inequality, we are not going to really move forward in a more long strategic vision. But Mao, this is important not only for the environmental sector, but also for the women movement and the organizations that are dealing with gender equality. I am conducting a study on differentiated impacts of land degradation and droughts, and look at all the CEDAW reports for the past 10 years. And there is a lack, a total lack, with exception of water, of understanding the linkages between gender equality and environmental degradation and climate change. So I think that the efforts needs to be conducted both within the environmental sector and both within the groups and initiatives that are working on gender equality to really have an impact on these structural knots. Mao, your phone is off. We can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, it's unmuted now. It's not unmute. But what I was saying is that, gender equality is quite important, but a listener just raised the issue around the role of indigenous women, for example, who are probably the most downtrodden, most impacted by the issues around gender inequality, and their voices are not heard. What is your reaction to that? And how do you include those voices in the work that you all do?
No, you want me to go answer, Mao?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
I just want to bring the point that Simon also brought about the intersectionality. We women are not the same. We women have a tremendous amount of diversity, and definitely it's not only indigenous women. Intersectionality, for example, between John, indigenous, Afro-descendant women from all around the world. And for example, here in Latin America, we're trying to, and we pass this agreement, the Escazú agreement, that really enhances the need for everybody's participation. And it also has one important element, is the protection of the environmental defenders, which the majority of them are indigenous peoples from our territories.
Thanks, Lorena. Betty, what are the barriers that, asking the same question, that you're seeing in the kind of work that you're doing to women's full participation, and what are the kind of enabling environment that needs to be created to ensure that women actually participate quite fully?
Thanks, Mao. And I'll speak, to obviously the sort of technical policy development perspective of things. And just from the South African experience that I've seen in the competition law space, for example, is that first of all, when it comes to, gender equality, I think for a very long time, economic policies sort of add a gender element just as an add-on, to tick a box, to say, well, there is, women are included, but, policies have not always been very intentional and direct about, addressing gender inequality. And quite often, some, policy measures, for example, are not evidence-based. So you sort of have, policies that are developed just to address gender at a high level and more broadly. And I think that is sort of, one of the key things that we need to be thinking about here. And in relation to, the barriers that women face, there are a number of barriers in the sense that they are, economically excluded from being able to participate in markets and being able to sort of, realize their aspirations, whether they are participating in markets as innovators, or as employers, or as employees, or owners of businesses. The way the structures and policies are built, they do not deliberately include women. So women are having to adopt their own strategies in order to navigate the challenges that they face. So some of the things that I would sort of suggest in terms of really being more direct and deliberate in including women in creating, policies that are inclusive. Some of the work that comes from the OECD project that I've worked on, in there we identified more specifically 5 pillars that are key. And just before talking about those 5 pillars, I would like to also say that what is important in developing, policies that will empower women is that we need to not only just include gender or have gendered considerations, but to actually include the perspectives of women, the very diverse perspectives of women, as someone was sort of noting in the comments. So now getting into the 5 pillars that are key for, developing a gender inclusive policy. The first one is positionality, which I've already touched on. There's a tendency to box women or to sort of, empower women as, society views women. Generally it's as consumers or, as employees. So in this regard, we really need to think more broadly and more than just about creating, like, for example, green jobs. We need to think about women in the ways that they are participating in green economies, the way that they are seeking to participate in those economies, and actually empower them in those ways and not just to silo them. And the second important thing for policy development is that when we are developing these policies, we really need to be purposeful and direct and deliberate in what it is that we want to achieve. So for example, if you look at the South African competition law in this regard in addressing racial inequality, it's very direct in the sense that it includes provisions that, look into the ownership stake of historically disadvantaged individuals in South Africa. So in this context is that, so for example, the comment that you made, Mao, about sustaining, ownership stakes of women. So we need to sort of have policies that are very deliberate about assessing, transactions or financing arrangements in terms of, what impact will they have on the ownership of women. And also some of the sort of key things that, are important here. And I won't touch on all the 5 pillars for now, but I'm sure I will touch on them in later questions. But one of the last pillars that I will touch on is, key stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders that should be engaging in this work, and the ones that should be, at the center of developing policies that include women, So we need to make sure that there are key stakeholders that are progressive and that will, push for the implementation of these policies in a way that center women in the many roles that they play. Thank you.
Thanks, Betty, for an elaborate input into that discussion. Cecilia, what is your perspective around some of the barriers that hinder women's full participation, and how can we create an enabling environment to unlock, more effective women participation on the transition issues?
Thank you, Mao. I think that the list of barriers are probably several, right? We can talk about lack of access to finance, lack of technology, absence of markets, trainings, mentorings, networks. There are lots of things that are actually highlighted in the literature. But I think one important thing, the more I sort of look at these things, the more I think they are more like the tip of the iceberg. Let me then give you an example. For instance, when we talk about lack of access to finance, there are some striking numbers that were presented by the IMF. For instance, the IMF reports that less than 3% of venture capital was invested in women-led companies. Only 11% of seed funding capital in emerging markets went to companies with women in their founding teams. So in general, women businesses are smaller, than men. So in general, in medium and small size enterprises, but they're usually more indebted. And they actually account for kind of 32% of the gender more in excess of the financing gap. So something is going on there, right? I think the most interesting explanation of these things, for instance, is that these kind of differences between men and women-owned enterprises cannot really be explained either by education, by experience, or by any kind of concrete factor. So, as a matter of fact, most of the time, they can be relied basically on biases, gender biases. So that's why I think it's a little bit, when we talk about lack of access to something, in general, what we really the whole issue boils down to societal issues, to real things that are kind of basically in the way society is organized, that really prevent women from being more active participants and actually making the whole, sector, in this case of green technologies and green transitions, to benefit actually from women's talent.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. Quite a staggering statistics there, and it clearly points to the challenge that is a systemic challenge that we face, is how society is organized, and how can we then unlock that to create the opportunities that women rightly deserve. Dimitra, what is your take around the barriers and how to unlock that?
Well, I think the others already covered a lot of the issues on access and finance, etc. And I also mentioned it a bit earlier. I think Cecilia's point on ingrained biases is key. And we cannot just, click wipe off everything that we know and just start afresh. So what we need to do is try to find ways to change things slowly. Of course, there are different areas where we need to work on. For the OECD, what we've tried to see specifically on the links between gender and environment is lack of data. So in order to be able to see specifically what is missing and what needs to be improved, we need to have the proper evidence and the proper data. And even though there is data available, it's not concrete and it's not there for every country. Even within the OECD family, where you would expect that more data is available, only 11 of the countries that mention that they do collect data only use gender considerations when they're applying environmental policies, which actually means that even when we do have data, we don't know how to use it. The second point is leadership, and it's including women in decision making. And that not only means at the highest level, but it means everywhere. And even though data might be different, and it varies according to countries and sectors, we see in the recent research we did in the OECD that the biggest gaps are present, of course, in low-income countries and in environmentally sensitive businesses, which is quite worrying, especially since low-income countries are the most exposed to climate change and biodiversity loss. But on the other hand, we see women's highest representation in leadership positions in civil society institutions and in international negotiations, which means that women do have a voice somewhere, and it needs to be enhanced further and be included more into the business world and into the national level. Of course, then we have issues of access to the labor market. That includes not only the environment sectors, but all the sectors. It's just that in the environment sectors, you have even less women. And of course, there's the issue of access to finance, which doesn't only include entrepreneurship, but it also includes sustainable finance and investment more generally. And it is a bigger issue of how we deal with it at the multilateral development banks, or even at the national level of public financing, etc. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Dimitra. You pointed out some really important issues, for example, around the data collection and the lack of data to inform decision making. You know, what that we're doing in Uganda at the moment, researching energy access and how it's distributed around gender and income groups and so on, is that oftentimes you find you have this data that says like, oh, enough access of, you know, off-grid solutions at this households. But if you actually interrogate decision making at the household level, or who actually utilizes the energy that's available at household level, you find women are completely marginalized. You go to a household where the only source of lighting, the husband is using it to, you know, to watch, listen to radio inside while the woman is, you know, cooking in darkness or using old technology. But the data tells you that, you know, there is energy access at that household level. So it's very, very important issue that you have raised around that. You know, having said all of this, you know, obviously it's not all gloom and doom. Where are the success stories? Are there any pockets of excellence that we're seeing, that we're emerging, that is telling us actually this is a benchmark that essentially we should be following in trying to mainstream gender equality? So I would like just you to share your own experiences in terms of any success stories that you have out there. And to our listeners, please, if you have any questions you would like to pose to our esteemed panelists, please put in the chat box. We have seen a couple of them who will respond and so on, but please engage your panelists. So yeah, let's talk about success stories now. Where are those pockets of excellence? Where are those examples of what success looks like on the ground? I don't want to call names now, but anyone who is ready to jump in can go on.
I can go. Thank you. I like to call them promising practices. And instead of successful stories, and they are all over the world, and they all have, and they all share something that is very important, and it's to this identification, understanding, and implementing intervention to address gender gaps and overcome historical gender biases, both in policies and interventions. Also, we see these promising practices, they're mobilizing more than one SDG at the time. So they're really doing an interaction with all of them. And I can give you an example. Costa Rica, from my country, we're very well known for our work on payment for environmental services linked to forest. But there is a structural problem. One of these knots is that women, even though in Costa Rica law you have the same right to put lands under men's and women's name, the fact is that there are less women that own land. So payment for environmental services is linked to land tenure. So we created this process to develop this seal for productive units, in which they have to fulfill a certain amount of criteria, which we developed with women from indigenous communities and rural areas, so that we can delink the payment for environmental services to land tenure, so that women and men can really benefit from these millions of dollars that Costa Rica is getting for its carbon sequestration program and for the payment for environmental services. But you have so many other initiatives. I invite you to look at Momentum for Change, the winners from the last years. We have this incredible initiative in Australia. It's not only in rural areas, but these are urban women really working on consumption. They're all over the world, these promising practices.
Thank you, Lorena. Any other taker around success stories and what you think the future looks like in terms of gender equality? Yeah, go ahead, Cecilia. I can see you're on mute. Can you unmute?
I think so. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I just wanted maybe to refer to, I think, you know, already the renewable energy sector appears to be like a successful story, you know, in the sense that it's actually attracting higher participation in the workforce as traditional, let's say, energy companies or energy sectors, right? I mean, what the INRENA, for instance, reports is that in the renewable energy sector, I mean, the proportion of women is around 32%, women workers, and the fossil fuel sector is 22%. You would tell me it's still low, right? I mean, we're expecting to have higher numbers, but in general, at least it's encouraging to see that, you know, these kind of relatively new sectors are sort of attracting more women, you know, in terms as workers, and presumably making them able to make a career and you know, sort of increasing the ranks in terms of, you know, taking further responsibilities. I just also wanted to refer very quickly to a project that a program that UNIDO has been sponsoring for some time together with the Global Environmental Fund. It's the Global Clean Tech Innovation Program. And the basic idea of this program is basically to support, you know, green entrepreneurs through knowledge sharing, through financial support, through networking, through promotion opportunities. This is really being implemented in several countries around the world, so it's a kind of large program. But what is very interesting is that at the beginning, this program, for instance, was able to reach only about 7% of beneficiaries women. And nowadays, now the program is in its second phase, it's already reaching around 40%. So I think also there, you know, you can really see at a more micro level that, you know, increasingly there is interest and, you know, for women to participate and to become really entrepreneurs in this kind of fields. And it's possible also to support them and actually to do sort of a kind of targeted interventions in order to reach them and help them make their way through, you know, when it comes to these, you know, new sectors and in clean technologies.
And Dimitra, what is the data telling you around success stories and where, you know, all of these need to go to? And I'd just like to link your response to a comment that has been made by Susannah, saying that, you know, there's a lot of activities that are happening on the ground, but they're often at a pilot phase. How do you actually ensure that these practices just become mainstream, they become really the way of how things are done, just beyond piloting and testing and so on?
So we also, I mean, the data that's available is again evidence and empirical evidence, more or less. So you do not have a proper, let's say, database that can provide you with all the information that can actually help you lead to a higher level of thought and policies, let's say. But we do have some good examples from at least from OECD countries. For example, in Sweden, it's very successful for urban planning and mobility patterns, that they do have a gender perspective, which is also quite green in its way, though, in the way that they develop their public transport networks, in the way that they promote women's mobility more than men's, because women actually do use public transport more than men. This is one typical example. It's also done in Vienna, in Austria, more on urban planning than mobility, but it's also done there. I know that Australia has a strategy for women in STEM, which is also key for environmental policies when you include women in STEM and in entrepreneurship. It's a grants program that actually promotes women with more innovative, let's say, ideas. And they provide the financing for the development of these ideas. We do have the C3E initiative, which is supported also from the International Energy Agency. It's the Clean Energy Education and Empowerment Initiative. It's in line with what Cecilia also mentioned. And there you have, for example, the US Energy Department with awards that are given to mid-career women in the clean energy sector to actually help them promote, enhance their work and actually advance even further. You do have such initiatives. You have a lot of groundwork done on waste management and circular economy, even in Europe, for example. And these are initiatives that are usually women-led. And it's tough to actually make the pilot program turn it into something more national based. That's usually because, at least I've been working on a Greek project and seeing how women's economic empowerment can be led through the green growth, and looking, for example, their circular economy strategy specifically, you see that there are a lot of policies and actions that could have a gender lens, but they don't necessarily have one directly, maybe indirectly. So there are points that you could include there on boosting women's participation in the green labor market and women's inclusion on green entrepreneurship, with specific, even consider positive discrimination to achieve gender equality. It's something. Feminizing green consumption patterns, supporting women's engagement with green innovation more specifically. This is something that needs to be done. And of course, enhancing women's representation in environment-related sectors. And I'm not talking about only in decision-making bodies, but also in public consultations where you do have a lot of voices, but women's voices are usually absent when we're talking about environmental issues, at least in the case of Greece. These are some of the points that we've seen, at least in our research.
No, thanks. I mean, from the, but then Simon, do you want to say something before I go to the next issue around how systems need to change to bring about the equality that's required? Do you have any remarks that you'd like to make?
Please go ahead, Mo.
Okay, cool. I mean, it's clear from the presentation that you have, I mean, the point that you've raised, to me at least, that a lot of the success stories seem to be relatively anecdotal, very, focused on locality and so on. They are not really, and oftentimes quickly they hit a barrier, and that barrier is a systems barrier. The kind of how society is organized has been raised, procedures and so on. Systems that essentially prevent, these innovative ideas from whether it's getting to market or being mainstream and so on. So starting with Betty, in your opinion, how do you think systems need to change to allow us to ensure that gender equality happens by ensuring enabling power sharing and at all levels of decision making and implementation for that matter?
Thanks for that, Mao. And really drawing on the work that South Africa has done through its competition law to realize racial equality. For example, when the sort of some examples that we are seeing in the competition law space, for example, is that South Africa uses its competition law to maybe prohibit some measures that raise concerns, not just market structure concerns, but concerns around, well, a measure is going to lead to a retrenchment of unskilled employees in the company who would otherwise find it hard to find an alternative job. If conditions can, for example, be imposed in those types of transactions, but also, imposing conditions on measures that would result in a reduction in the ownership stake of, historically disadvantaged individuals, for example. And those are very directed, deliberate measures that are can be adopted by the competition authorities because they have been included in the actual policy and in the legislation. So I think, you know, because these issues are systematic, and because, you know, policies as they currently exist are not as inclusive, especially when it comes to gender. So in order to move from a space where we're just sharing ideas and piloting, you know, projects that, you know, don't really scale up and maybe are not as progressive, we really need to also focus on what the policies look like. And I also do hear quite a lot that, you know, there isn't a lot of data available, and maybe that is the sort of, you know, lower hanging fruit, and that's where everyone starts, you know, to gather the data on the impact of the current policies on women, you know, in what ways do they hinder women. And it's also very important to make sure that the data and information we collate here is country specific, you know, because the circumstances of women in different parts of the world are very unique and very different. And I think this was what will enable us to then develop policies that are informed, and policies that when we do implement them are actually effective. And I will also warn that, you know, like, and I think this goes for, you know, all economic policies, that, you know, this is very conventional idea that, you know, economic policies need to focus on, you know, the economic aspect of things, and socioeconomic issues are not really relevant, which is something we've also seen in competition law quite a lot. But the South African example, and being able to move away from what everyone does when it comes to competition policy, has shown that it's possible to be more inclusive in, you know, how you develop your policies and in enforcement of those policies as well. So I think those are really some of the key things to think about. But as I said, the most important one is the lower hanging fruit, you know, it's trying to study the impact of current policies at the moment, and making sure that whatever policies we adopt are actually well informed and evidence based, and that moves us away from, you know, just having ideas on how we can, you know, include women in creating, you know, greener economies, but they can actually be at the center of those initiatives. Thank you.
Dimitra, yeah, go ahead if you want to respond. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
Following up on what Betty said on data and on available information, and linking it to the question we discussed before. At the OECD, we're working now with UNDP and UN Women, and we are developing the COVID Global Gender Response Tracker with a gender lens, or in short, because no one will remember the name, a gender green tracker. It's basically a database covering 200 countries and regions all over the world. So, and it will be including all the gender sensitive COVID-related policy measures with a green lens. We're looking at what countries are doing already. That, I think, will be, I mean, we're hopefully going to be releasing this in June, so in a couple of months. And I think that will provide a very good basis for governments to see what others are doing, how they're doing it, because there's a sectoral approach in it as well. So what they're doing in the energy sector, what they're doing in the transport sector, what they're doing in relation to social protection and unpaid care and labor policies, or even gender-based violence, because these are all linked. And that would help, we believe, countries to identify similar policies and how these are implemented, to see, of course, the differences and that exist in different countries, and take from that what they feel is needed. That's one thing. The second thing that we're doing at the OECD slowly is we're trying to start developing gender environment indicators. It's something that's a bit more challenging than we thought, because we don't always have the raw data. But this is something that we see there is some appetite for. And we're hoping that at least at the international level, there is some appetite. And we're hoping that this will be reflected also at the national level, and we can start collecting more data that will allow us, of course, to provide better policy analysis and policy advice for governments afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Dimitra. Lorena, you want to react? But being a former government
Yes.
minister, tell us.
I want to react to two things. For many years, I had a dream of having this accelerator, this initiative that will look at these promising practices and really boost them up and replicate them. But I think it's something that we can put our minds into it, especially in this context of this, the opportunity of this crisis to do this global reset. To my colleague from OECD, in early 2000, when I was in IUCN, we produced the Environmental Gender Index that you might want to look at it, because I mean, it is the first effort worldwide to look at some of these indicators, and could be a good way to start. And then what you ask us, I think that this crisis, as I said, is an opportunity for a global reset. But we need to infuse true gender responsive, sustainable policies and regulations into this economic reboot of building back greener. But also businesses need to rethink their operation with a special focus on gender responsive, green and sustainable supply chains, because there is a lot of area there to cover. And I think that the effort that the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership is doing is that we need a theoretical framework on how gender will be linked with this process of green, blue recovery and post-COVID-19 recovery programs. I think that we need to come together. I mean, what does this just word means for the private sector, for people that are working on the environmental sector? How does it look? And I think that we need that, and we need that pretty soon, because it's in some countries they're taking steps without really embracing gender equality.
Thanks, Lorena. Cecilia, you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think I wanted to react to the point that you raised. How do we go from pilots to something more, right? I think that's really a very, very valuable question. I mean, how do we really go from good practices to policies? I just wanted to refer, for instance, to an evaluation exercise that UNIDO performed in the framework of a project called Economic Empowerment of Women in Green Industry. This project was actually applied in Cambodia, Peru, Senegal, South Africa. And one of the findings of this study was basically that green industry, I mean, the policies fail to include really the gender equality measures. The thing is that even if in the cases when they have it, they were not really able to implement them. And I think this also is part of this discussion on how do we really have to enforce the logic of monitoring and evaluation of the policies that we have in many of our countries. Because this is the only way that we can really measure a little bit of what's going on, what's our measure of success, what are the results. And I think this is a part of the culture that I think we need to try to basically implement in a way of making this, supporting this transformation. And I think in the issues of gender equality are particularly important, because this is from these kind of exercises that you can actually get gender disaggregated data, you can get a better sense of what is really going on and what are the implications of the policies. But this is to say, this is again one example of the multiple things that could possibly be done. And it's not only from one actor, in the field that this can really be supported. I think, I mean, we are part of the UN family, of course, and when we are based in the field, we are also part of the UN country teams. And increasingly, our interventions are also framed together with other sister organizations, as Dimitra was mentioning. I mean, we work with UN Women, we work with UNDP, because our mandates are different and highly complementary. Yeah, so UNDP works more on issues of governance, which pertains, it's really square on the issues of policy formulation and laws. And UN Women, we know the mandate of gender mainstreaming and gender equality. So I think, the question, the thing is that it really depends on the realities of each of the countries, but of course it cannot be an isolated effort. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to move in any meaningful way.
Thanks, Cecilia. And just to the point around data and its uptake with countries, my experience shows that oftentimes government actually want to do the right thing. but they are constrained by various factors, lack of data, lack of capacity, and so on. So you find these bureaucrats who are overloaded. They want to do the right thing, but they're just not empowered enough to do the right thing. How would you react to that?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, we usually work also, when we do capacity development, or, you know, sort of raising awareness and providing, you know, tools to do gender analysis, we also involve our partners in the governments. So we try to do basically, you know, sort of capacity development, broadly speaking, because I mean, it's not an international organization that's going to be defining the policy in a country. Yeah? So I mean, the driving seat is, the government is in the driving seat, and we definitely need to support their efforts. So we tried as much as possible in all our interventions to try to do this kind of you know, capacity development training and things that can really support people to have better tools in order to improve the quality of the normative, you know, outputs that they are working on.
Cool. Thanks, Cecilia. Any other person wants to react? Any final thoughts, remarks that you would like to make? Yes, Betty?
I think Simon can go ahead before me. I'll go after him.
Oh, yes. Okay. I did Simon. Sorry, Simon. Go ahead, Simon.
Thank you very much. This is a fascinating discussion, and it has really, really helped Susannah and I to clarify how we're going to go forward with the study that we mentioned in the keynote. It's really gratifying to hear that working out what we need to look for in terms of outcomes can contribute to raising the ambition, which is really what we're setting out to do. I do hope that this juncture, this recovery from the pandemic, will enable us to realize that the vehicle that some men are saying that we're going to build back and get back better onto is not the vehicle we want to be traveling on. Let's use this sort of this turbulence in the system and this economic and social crisis to question the vehicle we want to be traveling on. And if we can make it a green vehicle with renewable fuels with a woman driver, so much the better. So thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss with you. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Simon. Betty?
Thanks, Mal. I think just one last thought that I sort of wanted to share is really just what I'm getting is also that there is, you know, intersectionality between what's happening in competition law and what's also happening in relation to sustainability. For example, I know Dimitra will probably know this, that, you know, there's quite a lot of work that the OECD is doing in looking at competition law and sustainable development. And I think just to highlight, you know, competition law can play a very important role in also changing, you know, the structures of the market that can create more space for women and can also sort of accelerate some of the initiatives that women are involved in. So, for example, we're seeing that a lot of competition authorities are really taking into account sustainability considerations when they're investigating cases. For example, you know, the OECD recently, you know, fined certain automotive OEMs in relation to conduct that they were engaging in, which was sort of restricting innovation in the space. But also competition law can be used to advance, you know, business initiatives or industry initiatives that are pro-sustainability. For example, in Australia recently, they sort of exempt or authorized you know, practices by, you know, a batteries, you know, sustainability scheme that was being created there to sort of, you know, find a way to make sure that batteries are disposed in a more sustainable way that is, you know, good for, you know, public health and safety. So what I'm saying really with these ideas that I'm sharing with you is that if there are initiatives in the gender space, you know, that are, you know, pro-women and more sustainable, but maybe they might need a buy-in of competition authorities in order, for example, to allow two firms, smaller firms who are doing amazing things separately, but they need to scale up in order for the impact to be, you know, more significant. You know, competition authorities and competition law can play a role in sort of helping scale up some of those initiatives, but also if there are some hindrances that are there, which are market-based, if there are systems that are in place which prevent, either women or pro-green initiatives in general, where competition law can play a role in, investigations or conducting market studies. I think there's quite a lot of work that can be done alongside, institutions that, focus on competition law and those that focus on sustainability. And we definitely are seeing that in the global competition policy. And the great thing with the competition law space as well is that, a lot of the research that takes place at like the OECD level, for example, does filter down to, policy at a sort of national level for different countries. So I think there's quite a bit of, space for collaboration, I think, at a policy level, even for specific countries, to think about if, a country wants to develop, pro sustainability policies, to also think about what competition law can do in order to, facilitate that. And with the research that's already happening at the OECD, it'll be easier for countries to sort of tap into that work and develop more informed policies. Thank you.
Thanks, Betty, for a very well articulated issue around the role of competition law. My question, Betty, just as a wrap-up, obviously, is that if I see South Africa, for example, the role of the competition law is very effective in many respects. But if you look through the rest of the continent, it's not necessarily the same, even from sustainability practices. So you find companies would adhere to certain sustainability practices where the competition law is effective. But as soon as they step across the border, all those books are thrown out are thrown out. How do we hold companies accountable in that regard?
Yeah, I think when it sort of comes to the other African countries, a lot of the other African countries are only now starting to adopt competition laws. And I think the nice thing with what's happening as well is that the competition community is very close, and all the countries that are now adopting competition laws are actually, looking into what South Africa has been doing, looking into what, has been sort of happening in relation, to international research and all of that work. So, I mean, when it comes to sort of then holding, companies accountable, it is definitely hard to, force a change of behavior in companies when you do not have a policy that would back those initiatives. So I think that is a key issue. And it also can be an issue in relation to, all the initiatives that we have spoken about today in relation to gender and sustainability, is that, we really do need the backing of policies, and not just one policy from a government, but, to say, if we are developing a gender-specific, sustainability-specific policy, that policy or those policy considerations need to also apply in all the other economic policies, really, that, are relevant. So the intersectionality amongst those different policies is also key. And I think when you look at South Africa, for example, the agenda from government is very clear when it comes to using competition law for transformative change, to include more Black people in the economy, but not only to just participate, for example, but to be able to meaningfully participate. So I think all of those, I guess the consensus at the government level, it means what happens in practice on the ground is more effective. And I think, for government to step up, that's how we're really going to be able to hold companies accountable and actually see a change of behavior. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Betty. I see we're almost running out of time. We've got about 7 minutes to wrap up. So I'd just like to go around the table for you to make your last remarks. And while you're making the remarks, just tell us what are some of the 2 key takeaways that you think are really critical for us to move this conversation just beyond a conversation into real action on the ground. Any takers?
Well, I will start since I am next to you on the panel vision. I really think that we really need this theoretical framework on how we're going to do this, and that we join efforts, that it's a really a combined effort in which then we can start putting them into practice and feeding back among ourselves and what is working and how is not working, and what were the success stories, if you want to call them like that, in this respect. But we need to unified efforts, because what has happened in the other processes is that they're very sparse. People are doing it in one way or different ways. But now what we require for these green and blue transition and post-COVID recovery initiatives is an effort among as many specialists on this topic to keep together and unfold it, and then do convince other countries that do not take part into this process, like through OECD and the UNDP and the United Nations agencies, on the value of doing it and the how to do it, Mao, because the problem is how to do it. What does it mean? I mean, there are good willingness in a lot of countries. They said, yes, I want to bring gender equality, but I have no idea how to link that to the green transition. What are the linkages? What are they? So we need to create, again, this unified effort that we can push forward.
Thank you, Lorena. Well put. Cecilia or Dimitra, your parting shots?
Okay, I can go. Thank you. I would say just quickly, I think we also have, as part of this broader community, to be able to be aware of our own biases, really try to break them, really not give in, into biases. For heaven's sake, don't say, girls, you cannot do this because you're a girl. I think we need more women, in technical fields, in particular, if we really want to have a successful transition towards, sustainability. We need more women because we need more role models, we need more mentors, we need more members of this network in order to make this conversation broader and richer and larger. So I think the issue of biases is, for me, very, very important, and this is the thought I would really like to share with you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Dimitra?
Yes, I think I will agree with the previous speakers. What at the OECD we've been trying to push through is an integrated policy framework that covers both gender and environmental sustainability. And I'm not talking about gender mainstreaming in environmental policies. I'm speaking about something broader. I'm speaking about what Betty mentioned, having a gender environment nexus perspective in competition law, in taxation policies, in the way that you do budgeting, in the way that you do investment policies and how you apply ESG standards. This is something broader, and it is, I think that's the key, that sustainability can be something that includes fairness and inclusiveness, and the environmental aspect as well. It's much broader. So this is the perspective that we've been having. Of course, taking this to the ground is a bit more difficult, let's say, in the sense that you need to take into consideration the intersectionalities, the differences between countries, between regions, even at the local level. And these are things that need to be looked at. That brings us back to data, that brings us back to women's engagement and empowerment, and that brings us back again to financial support and financing for projects that can promote women's economic empowerment and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon, any shots in this discourse?
Yes, thank you. Takeaways from this session. I guess my main takeaway is the fact that I'm actually more optimistic about the changes in front of us now than I was an hour and a half ago. Having done this initial piece of work looking at the way that different approaches are enabling us to reveal what should be the outcomes of just transitions in terms of gender equality, I was rather pessimistic, to be honest with you. We weren't seeing through the lens that we were looking at these. What we were hoping to see that were many cases of positive deviance. And now members of the panel and others in the audience have been indicating some of these to us, so there's lots to learn from. I'm also more optimistic because echoing in my head was a comment I heard the other day, that actually across Africa, in terms of just transitions, the types of people that are becoming involved with them, particularly those just transitions that are really involving the youth, there are signs that the gender equality that is a value and a good amongst the younger generation is stronger than the older generation. So that's another reason to be optimistic.
Thanks, Simon. And I couldn't agree more with you about the role of youth in advancing the just transition, and particularly we're seeing with young women activists on the continent. You know, they think about the climate activists who are, you know, very well articulated and are out there pushing this agenda. It's really optimistic. The work that I do with entrepreneurs, we oftentimes find there's a lot of innovations that are coming from women-led, you know, startups and so on. So it's really excellent sign. So yes, I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but also I'm cautiously optimistic that we're making progress. We just need to keep pushing that progress and talking to our policymakers or leaders, and at all levels, and consider this issue of intersectionality as being very, very critical. For example, one person raised in the comment section around the role of seeing women when they are more impacted and they are more discriminated against. So there's all these nuances that exist in gender inequality that we would like to, needs to be addressed. So my takeaways, first of all, is just a word of gratitude to all of you. I came into this session, I was very nervous. I had no idea. I've never engaged in. My only experience with issue of gender equality, I think, was as a young man growing up. I was the only boy in a female-dominated Sunday school choir. And I got teased about it. No wonder I didn't have any career as a singer. Not that I can sing, but it's really, really important, this conversation that we've had today, and the takeaways that you have all raised, I think, are really, really important. Talking about collective action, checking biases, the importance of youth, and really making sure that gender equality goes beyond just the mainstreaming, but actually speaks into the policies and laws that all countries need to enact. And for me, more importantly, the idea of evidence-based policy making and decision making. The work that OECD is doing, if it can trickle down to those countries, those communities that require that data, I think it's really going to be very critical in ensuring that this conversation just moves beyond a conversation, but really action on the ground. And then hopefully we're able to see the change that we require in the next, hopefully less than a decade. So on that note, I would like to bring this dialogue into a close. I would like to thank you, my panelists, Lorena, Betty, Dimitra, Cecilia, Simon. Thank you for an excellent input. And more important, to our audience, it's a pity we never heard your voices, but we've received your comments, we've put resources in there, get in touch. And yeah, so I would like to say thanks to all of you, and I would like to bring this meeting to a close.
Thank you, Mao, for an excellent moderation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.